Fall is a season of death, and springtime is a season of rebirth. And that's the topic that I'd like to speak about today, called the restoration of all things. It's been lost in modern church times, but it certainly was taught in early Christianity. And it causes a lot of confusion among Christians and separation of various Christian sects, teaching that, for instance, only the elect will be restored to heaven, or only 144,000 will be restored to heaven, and the billions and billions and billions of other souls will be lost. That's not what the early Christians taught. The problem stems from the fact that the Bible is an incomplete story of heaven, of hell, of life on earth, and what the afterlife is like. This is because that the priests, the scribes, and the rulers of Christianity have highly edited what came into the Bible. And one of the most successful biblical scholars proved this when he took the 5 major versions of the Old Testament at the time of Jesus and compared them, and saw within a mere 1,000 years how much the Old Testament had changed over time, with 5 various versions that didn't agree with each other. And then the original version of the Old Testament had been lost by the time of Jesus. So they had nothing to go back to of the original text. Well, the same thing happened to the New Testament. Today, we can't go back and see the entire text, original text, that the apostles wrote. Many pieces are missing, and many pieces stem from the 4th century, when the first Bible was collated by the leaders of the church. And for example, they left numerous pieces out of that Bible. One of them is the book of Enoch, for example, but there are others that were left out. And it was written after Origen of Alexandria had published all of his works. He was the most prolific biblical scholar that ever lived, and he fulfilled the promise of Jesus to explain all the unbearable truth that he was unable to explain in his 3 short years of ministry. Origen penned what is called the restoration of all things, and it is the truth that Jesus could not explain to his disciples because it's unbearable for them. It was unbearable to think that all of the disciples had forsaken their king in heaven and were cast out of heaven. But that's what the restoration of all things discusses, is the good news that Jesus brought, and that is that he came to restore heaven to its greatness, to restore all of the fallen to heaven. But that can't happen in a mere 6,000 years. It takes billions and billions of years for this restoration process to happen. It started long before the Big Bang, 14 billion years ago or so. It started in the spiritual world, this restoration, and it continues today. And God sent the King of Heaven, his only Son, Jesus Christ, to incarnate on this earth, to finish the restoration process by defeating death, defeating Satan, and passing final judgment over him. And that final judgment will exist until the end of this world, which will be in a few billion years. It's not going to end tomorrow, like most people, most religions are teaching, that the end is coming. It's not coming. That is how all of the fallen, and including Lucifer, the leader of the rebellion, will eventually return to heaven, and return in the way that God intended. Jesus told us in Matthew 5 that we need to become perfect as God is perfect, as God created us. And that doesn't happen in one lifetime. That takes multiple lifetimes for us to become perfect. Well, of course, the missing part of the story is the story of rebirth. And many modern Christians reject the concept of rebirth, of reincarnation, of multiple lives. Whereas the nature shows us of a continuous cycle of life and death. It's proof before us to show that life and death exists and rebirth exists. There's a lot of scientific evidence of reincarnation, of past lives, of life after death, and there's no evidence of eternal damnation. No near-death experiences have shown this eternal torment, but life and hope. So remember, it was men who built this. It was men who built the church. It was men who edited the Bible, who copied it, translated it. Not God, and not necessarily godly men who did this. There were so many pagan influences that influenced the church in its early years. Constantine, Justinian, and plus all of the scribes that Jesus and the prophets talk about, who confused the Word of God, who made it so that it's easy to take the Bible out of context, out of its original meaning, and to pick and choose the meanings that you want to have. That's why there are so many different religious sects around the world that are just based on one book. But we have the truth all around us. So please, take Jesus's suggestion. Seek for the truth, because you won't find it unless you look for it. That's a spiritual law that he talks about. We have to search for the truth, because it's not laying on the street. It's not being taught in churches. It's not on the billboards. It's not on television. You have to search for it, because the truth is rare. I'll leave you with two parables of Jesus to meditate on, to think about what I've said. And that is the parable of the prodigal son, to start with. Many people believe that this is a story of somebody who's just gone astray in their lifetime. But think about the symbolism that Jesus tells us here. We have a good father whose younger son squanders his inheritance and goes often to destroy everything that he had. And when he finally comes back, there is a great celebration for his return. And the older son is there and was true to the father all this time. Now, you can talk about that as being an individual experience, but Jesus had much deeper meanings in all of his parables. The good father is the father that Jesus taught us about. The older son is Jesus himself. The younger son is Lucifer. who took 1/3 of heaven with him. He squandered his inheritance in the literal sense. And that's the hope that Jesus gives us, that even Lucifer one day will be celebrated when he comes home. But not immediately. He has a long path to take in front of him before he realizes what he's done wrong. And that will take billions of years. The other parable to think about is the parable of the lost sheep. Again, many Christians think that Jesus only worries about his sheep. But read the Bible further. We know that God created everything through Jesus. Everything in heaven and on earth, he created through Jesus. And then he gave everything to Jesus. Everything in creation was given to Jesus. And that means when Jesus says he will not let one of his sheep be lost, it means each and every one of us, everything in creation, he will not let be lost. And those are the parables that support this restoration of all things that Origen taught and was taught by Arius, by many others in early Christianity, until it was finally destroyed by the Roman Emperor. And that part of history you cannot ignore, what the Romans did to the Word of God. They destroyed so much. They edited so much. That's why it required a reformation. But that reformation was just a beginning. And there's a new reformation going on now. So search for the truth. It's there. And it is loving, caring to all peoples, not just Christians.